Welcome dear audience, student and scholars. Here I am Dr. Namjad Ali, dear scholars. So far as we have discussed about stabilization policy, and we have highlighted that stabilization policy should be active or passive. Now we have another debatable issue among the economists is whether economic policy should be conducted by rule or by discretion. So for this purpose, in this video we are going to discuss stabilization policy. Should policy be conducted by rule or by discretion? So let's first discuss about rules versus discretion. Policy is conducted by rule. If policymakers announce in advance how policy will respond to various situations and commit themselves to following through on this announcement. Policy is conducted by discretion. If policymakers are free to size up events as they occur and choose whatever policy they consider appropriate at the time. Dear scholars, the debate over rules versus discretion is distinct from the debate over passive versus active policy. Policy can be conducted by rule and yet be either passive or active. For example, a passive policy rule might specify steady growth in the money supply of 3% per year. An active policy rule might specify that money growth is equal to 3% plus into unemployment rate minus 6%. Under this rule, the money supply grows at 3% if the unemployment rate is 6%. But for every percentage point by which the unemployment rate exceeds 6%, money growth increases by an extra percentage point. This rule tries to stabilize the economy by raising money growth when the economy is in a recession. We have started a discussion here why policy might be improved by a commitment to a policy rule, and after that we will examine several possible policy rules. Okay, let's discuss about the distrust of policymakers and the political process. Some economists believe that economic policy is too important to be left to the discretion of policymakers, although this view is more political than economic. Evaluating it is central to how we judge the role of economic policy. If politicians are incompetent or opportunistic, then we may not want to give them the discretion to use the powerful tools of monetary and fiscal policy. Incompetence in economic policy arises for several reasons. Some economists view the political process as erratic, perhaps because it reflects the shifting power of special interest groups. In addition, macroeconomics is complicated and politicians often do not have sufficient knowledge of it to make informed judgments. This ignorance allows charlatans to propose incorrect but superficially appealing solution to complex problems. The political process often cannot weed out the advice of charlatans from that of competent economists. Okay, while discussion about the distrust of policymakers and the political process, here we have some other reasons as well. Opportunism is economic policy arises when the objectives of the policymakers conflict with the well-being of the public. Some economists fear that politicians use macroeconomic policy to further their own electorate ends. If citizens vote on the basis of economic conditions prevailing at the time of election, then politicians have an incentive to pursue policies that will make the economy look good during election years. A president might cause a recession soon after coming into office to the lower inflation and then stimulate the economy as the next election approaches to lower unemployment. This would ensure that both inflation and unemployment are low on election day. Okay, manipulation of the economy for electoral gain, called the political business cycles, has been the subject of extensive research by economists and political scientists. Distrust of the political process leads some economists to advocate placing economic policy outside the realm of politics. Some have proposed constitutional amendments such as a balanced budget amendment that would tie the hands of legislators and insulate the economy from both incompetence and opportunism. Okay, moving towards the time inconsistency of discretionary policy. If we assume that we can trust our policymakers' discretion at first glance appears superior to be a fixed policy rule. Discretionary policy is by its nature flexible. As long as policymakers are intelligent and benevolent, there might appear to be little reason to deny them flexibility in responding to changing conditions. Yet a case for rules over discretion arises from the problem of time inconsistency of policy. In some situations, policymakers may want to announce in advance the policy they will follow to influence the expectations of private decision makers, but later, after the private decision makers have acted on the basis of their expectations, these policymakers may be tempted to renege on their announcement. Understanding that policymakers may be inconsistent over time, private decision makers are led to distrust policy announcement. In this situation, to make their announcement credible, policymakers may want to make a commitment to a fixed policy rule. Moving toward the further discussion about the time inconsistency of discretionary policy. Time inconsistency is illustrated most simply with a political rather than an economic example, specifically public policy about negotiating with terrorists over the release of hostages. The announced policy of many nations is that they will not negotiate over hostages. Such an announcement is intended to deter terrorists. If there is nothing to be gained from kidnapping hostages, rational terrorists would not kidnap any. In other words, the purpose of the announcement is to influence the expectations of the terrorists and thereby their behavior as well. But in fact, unless the policymakers are credibly committed to the policy, the announcement has little effect. Terrorists know that once hostages are taken, policymakers face an overwhelming temptation to make some concession to obtain the hostages release. The only way to deter rational terrorists is to take away the discretion of policymakers and commit them to a rule of never negotiating. Okay, if policymakers were truly unable to make concession, the incentive for the terrorists to take hostages would be largely eliminated. Okay, moving toward the further discussion about the time inconsistency of discretionary policy. The same problem arises less dramatically in the conduct of the monetary policy. Consider the dilemma of the Fed Reserve that cares about both inflation and unemployment. According to the Phillips curve, the trade-off between inflation and unemployment depends on expected inflation. The Fed would prefer everyone to expect low inflation so that it will face a favorable trade-off to reduce expected inflation. And the Fed might announce that low inflation is the paramount goal of monetary policy. But an announcement of a policy of low inflation is by itself not credible. Once households and firms have formed their expectation of inflation and set wages and prices accordingly, the Fed has an incentive to renege on its announcement and implement expansionary monetary policy to reduce unemployment. People understand the Fed's incentive to renege and therefore do not believe the announcement in the first place. Just as a president facing a hostage crisis is tempted to negotiate their release, a Federal Reserve with discretion is tempted to inflate in order to reduce unemployment. And just as terrorist discount announced policy of never negotiating households and firm discount announced policy of low inflation. The surprising outcome of this analysis is that policymakers can sometimes better achieve their goals by having their discretion taken away from them. In the case of rational terrorists, fewer hostages will be taken and killed if policymakers are committed to following the seemingly harsh rule of refusing to negotiate for the hostages' freedom. In the case of monetary policy, there will be lower inflation without high unemployment if the Fed is committed to a policy of zero inflation. Okay, moving toward the further discussion about the time inconsistency of discretionary policy. The time inconsistency of policy arises in many other contexts. Here are some examples. To encourage investment, the government announces that it will not tax income from the capital, but after factories have been built, the government is tempted to renege on its promise to raise more tax revenue from them. To encourage research, the government announces that it will give a temporary monopoly to companies that discover new drugs. But after a drug has been discovered, the government is tempted to revoke the patent or to regulate the price to make the drug more affordable. Okay, another example, to encourage good behavior, a parent announces that he or she will punish a child whenever the child breaks a rule. But after the child has misbehaved, the parent is tempted to forgive the transgression because punishment is unpleasant for the parent as well as for the child. To encourage you to work hard, your professor announces that this course will end with an exam. But after you have studied and learned all the material, the professor is tempted to cancel the exam so that he or she would not have to grade it. Okay, in each case, a rational agent understands the incentive for the policymakers to renege, and this expectation affect their behavior. And in each case, the solution is to take away the policymakers' discretion with a credible commitment to a fixed policy rule. Okay, moving towards the rules for monetary policy. Even if we are convinced that policy rules are superior to discretion, the debate over macroeconomic policy is not over. If the Fed were to commit to a rule for the monetary policy, what rule should it choose? Let's discuss briefly three possible policy rules that various economists advocate. Okay, here we have first, some economists called the monetarists advocate that Fed keep the money supply growing at a steady rate. Monetarists believe that fluctuations in the money supply are responsible for most large fluctuations in the economy. They argue that slow and steady growth in the money supply would yield stable output, employment, and prices. A monetarist policy rule might have prevented many of the economic fluctuations we have experienced historically, but most economists believe that it is not the best possible policy rule. Steady growth in the money supply stabilizes aggregate demand only if the velocity of money is stable. But sometimes the economy experiences shocks such as shift in the money demand that cause velocity to be unstable. Okay, moving towards the further explanation about the rules versus monetary policy. Most economists believe that a policy rule need to allow the money supply to adjust to various shocks to the economy. Okay, moving toward the second possible policy rule, policy rule that economists widely advocate is nominal GDP targeting. Under this rule, the Fed announces a planned path for nominal GDP. If nominal GDP arises above the target, the Fed reduces money growth to dampen aggregate demand. If it falls below the target, the Fed raises money growth to stimulate aggregate demand, because a nominal GDP target allows a monetary policy to adjust to changes in the velocity of money. Most economists believe that it would lead to greater stability in output and prices than a monetarist policy rule. A third possible policy rule is that is often advocated is inflation targeting. Under this rule, the Fed would announce a target for inflation rate, usually a low one, and then adjust the money supply when the actual inflation rate deviates from the target. Like nominal GDP targeting, inflation targeting insulates the economy from changes in the velocity of money. In addition, an inflation target has the political advantage of being easy to explain to the public. Notice that all these rules are expressed in terms of some nominal variables, the money supply, nominal GDP, or the price level. One can also imagine policy rules expressed in terms of real variables. For example, the Fed might try to target the unemployment rate at 5%. The problem with such a rule is that no one knows exactly what the natural rate of unemployment is. If the Fed choose a target for the unemployment rate below the natural rate, the result would be accelerating inflation. Conversely, if the Fed choose a target for the unemployment rate above the natural rate, the result would be accelerating deflation in the economy. For this reason, economists rely and they advocate rules for the monetary policy expressed solely in terms of real variables, even though real variables such as unemployment and real GDP are the best measures of economic performance. So this is all about stabilization policy. Should stabilization policy be conducted by rule or by discretion? So see you with another video. Ciao.